When his desperate attempt to understand why his horses avoided a 40-acre section of his Colorado ranch led him to sweep the field with a metal detector. 58-year-old cattle rancher Jake Morrison uncovered a crashed World War II military transport plane containing $40 million in gold bars meant for Allied operations, proving that sometimes the most puzzling mysteries hide the most extraordinary treasures. The Circle M Ranch sprawls across 2,400 acres of some of the most beautiful grazing land in Colorado. Nestled in the Pine Valley about 60 miles west of Colorado Springs, the property sits at an elevation of 7,200 feet, where the Great Plains begin their dramatic rise toward the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. On clear mornings, which come about 300 days a year in this high desert climate, you can see all the way to Pikes Peak, its granite summit catching the first light of dawn like a beacon. The ranch isn't the biggest operation in Pine Valley. That honor belongs to the sprawling Triple Bar spread that covers nearly 15,000 acres to the north. But the Circle M has something that money can't buy. A reputation built over 4 generations of Morrison men who understood that successful ranching isn't about the size of your spread, but about knowing every acre like the back of your weathered hand. The Morrison family story began in 1889, when Jake's great-grandfather, Samuel Morrison, filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of what was then considered marginal grazing land. Samuel had come west from Iowa with nothing but a pregnant wife, 2 young sons, and an unshakable belief that a man could build something lasting if he was willing to work hard enough and think long enough. Samuel Morrison had been right about the land's potential, though it took him 20 years to prove it. The high elevation and short growing season meant that traditional farming was nearly impossible, but the native grasses that grew in the valley were perfect for cattle. By 1910, Samuel had expanded his holdings to 800 acres and was running 200 head of cattle. More importantly, he had learned to read the subtle signs that separated successful ranchers from those who went broke, fighting the land instead of working with it. When Samuel's son Thomas inherited the ranch in 1923, he brought a formal education in animal husbandry and an understanding of emerging scientific approaches to cattle breeding. Thomas expanded the operation to 1,200 acres and built the reputation that made the Circle M brand respected throughout Colorado. He was one of the first ranchers in the region to understand the importance of rotational grazing, genetic improvement through selective breeding, and maintaining detailed records of everything from rainfall to feed costs. Thomas's son, Robert, Jake's father, took over the ranch in 1961 and completed the expansion to its current 2,400 acres. Robert Morrison was known throughout Pine Valley as a man who could predict weather patterns 2 weeks out, spot illness in cattle before symptoms appeared, and somehow always know exactly which pastures needed rest and which were ready for grazing. Other ranchers came to Robert for advice on everything from grass management to equipment purchases, and his quiet wisdom had prevented more than one neighbor from making expensive mistakes. Jake Morrison stood 6 feet tall, with the lean, wiry build that comes from 32 years of physical work and high altitude. His hands told the story of his life, calloused from handling rope and tools, scarred from working with animals and machinery, but surprisingly gentle when examining a sick calf or calming a spooked horse. At 58, his dark hair had gone mostly gray at the temples, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of decades spent squinting into bright Colorado's sun and calculating distances across vast pastures. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., Jake Morrison began his day the same way his father and grandfather had before him. Coffee first, black, strong, and made in the same enamel pot that had been in the family for 40 years. Then a check of the weather, forecast, though Jake trusted his own observations more than any meteorologist. Finally, a walk to the barn to check on the horses and plan the day's work. The Morrison ranch house hadn't changed much since. Robert had built the current structure in 1965. The kitchen still featured the original knotty pine cabinets and linoleum floors that Sarah had chosen when she and Jake were first married. The living room walls were covered with 4 generations of family photographs. Great-grandfather Samuel standing proud beside his first prize bull, Grandfather Thomas on horseback during a cattle drive, Father Robert shaking hands with the governor, at some long-forgotten ceremony, but it was the kitchen table that truly represented the heart of the Morrison family legacy. The massive oak piece had been hand-built by Samuel Morrison in 1892, and every major decision about the ranch had been made while sitting around its scarred surface. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, and death certificates had all been signed on this table. Jake's homework had been done here, along with his father's before him. Sarah had planned her garden layouts on this table. Jake still used it for everything from veterinary examinations to equipment repair. The ranch house sat on a small rise that provided views in every direction across the property. From the front porch, Jake could see the eastern pastures where the cattle typically spent their mornings. The back porch looked west toward the mountains, and the higher pastures where the cattle moved during the hot summer months. To the north lay the hay fields that provided winter feed, and to the south was the section of land that would soon become the center of Jake's greatest mystery. Sarah Morrison had been gone for 4 years, but her presence still filled every corner of the ranch house. Her garden tools still hung in the mudroom, though the flower beds she had tended with such care were now mostly overrun with weeds. Her recipe cards remained in the kitchen drawer, written in the careful handwriting that Jake had learned to read like a familiar language. Books still filled the shelves in the living room, romance novels mixed with gardening guides and veterinary manuals. Sarah Mitchell had come to the Circle M as a young veterinarian fresh out of Colorado State University, hired by Robert Morrison to help modernize the ranch's animal health programs. What Robert hadn't counted on was his son Jake falling head over heels for the smart, determined woman who could deliver a calf with one hand and take detailed medical notes with the other. Jake and Sarah had married in 1987, and for 26 years she had been not just his wife, but his partner in every aspect of ranch operations. Sarah had brought a scientific approach to animal health that complemented Jake's intuitive understanding of cattle behavior. Together, they had built the Circle M into one of the most respected operations in Colorado. Known for producing healthy cattle and maintaining sustainable grazing practices, Sarah's battle with ovarian cancer had lasted 18 months, and Jake had watched the strongest woman he'd ever known gradually weaken despite the best medical care Denver could provide. She had insisted on working as long as possible, checking cattle and maintaining her detailed health records until just weeks before her death. Her final request had been that Jake continue the work they had built together and not let grief destroy what 4 generations of Morrisons had created. Their daughter Emma had inherited her mother's scientific mind and her passion for animal medicine, but not her love for ranch life. Dr. Emma Morrison Chen was now a small animal veterinarian in Denver, married to a software engineer named David, and raising 2 young children in a suburban neighborhood that might as well have been on another planet from the Circle. Emma May visited the ranch 4 or 5 times a year, usually for holidays or special occasions, but Jake could see that she found the isolation and physical demands of ranch life increasingly foreign. Her children, Jake's grandchildren, 2-year-old Michael and 6-year-old Sophie, loved the ranch in the way that city children love any adventure. But Jake knew they would never choose this life for themselves. The generational gap wasn't unusual in ranching families. Jake had seen it happen to neighbors throughout the valley as young people chose careers in cities and left family ranches to be sold to developers or absorbed into larger operations. The economic realities of modern ranching made it increasingly difficult for properties to support multiple families. The social isolation that hadn't bothered previous generations felt overwhelming to young people accustomed to constant connectivity and entertainment options. Ranch life follows rhythms that have remained unchanged for generations. It's dictated by animal needs, weather patterns, and the simple reality that cattle require attention every single day. Regardless of holidays, illness, or personal preferences, Jake's typical day began before sunrise with a check of the animals. His 12 horses lived in the pasture closest to the house, and they would gather at the fence when they heard him approaching, hoping for the handful of grain he usually carried in his jacket pocket. These weren't show horses or recreational animals, they were working partners, each with specific skills and temperaments that Jake matched to particular tasks. His cattle herd consisted of 380 head of Black Angus, chosen for their ability to thrive in high-altitude conditions and their reputation for producing quality beef. Jake knew every animal individually, not by name, but by the subtle differences in markings, behavior, and lineage that told him which cattle were the daughters of his best producers and which young bulls showed the most promise for breeding. The ranch was divided into 12 pastures, each with its own water source and gate system that allowed Jake to rotate the cattle according to grass conditions and seasonal patterns. In the spring, cattle grazed the lower pastures where grass emerged earliest. Summer brought moves to higher elevations where cooler temperatures and mountain runoff provided better growing conditions. Fall meant gathering cattle from the scattered summer pastures and preparing them for winter feeding. Winter was the most challenging season, and cattle required daily feeding of hay that Jake cut and stored during the brief summer growing season. The hay operation alone required 2 months of intensive work cutting, raking, baling, and storing nearly 800 tons of hay that would feed the herd through the long Colorado winter. Pine Valley, Colorado, population 847, existed primarily to serve the ranching community that surrounded it. The town consisted of a main street 6 blocks long, containing everything a rancher might need: a feed store, a veterinary clinic, a bank, a cafe, a gas station, and a small grocery store that somehow managed to stock everything from engine oil to birthday cards. Every Tuesday morning, Jake joined the informal gathering of local ranchers at Maggie's Cafe for coffee and the kind of wide-ranging conversation that covered everything from cattle prices to local politics. These men, and they were mostly men, though a few widows and daughters had inherited operations, represented a dying breed of American independence. There was Ed Baker, whose family had been ranching in the valley almost as long as the Morrisons, ran 500 head on 3,000 acres, and was known for his ability to predict commodity prices with uncanny accuracy. Frank Henderson operated a smaller spread but had developed a reputation for breeding cattle that could thrive in the harsh winter conditions that occasionally swept down from the mountains. Tom Reeves was the youngest of the group at 45, having taken over his father's ranch just 5 years earlier. Tom brought modern ideas about genetics and technology that sometimes clashed with traditional approaches, but his willingness to experiment had already improved his cattle quality significantly. The older ranchers watched Tom's innovations with the careful attention of men who couldn't afford expensive mistakes but also understood that adaptation was essential for survival. In a community of men who prided themselves on understanding livestock, Jake Morrison had developed a reputation that bordered on supernatural. Other ranchers brought him their most difficult cases: cattle that wouldn't breed, horses that seemed spooked by invisible threats, behavioral problems that defied conventional solutions. Jake's gift wasn't mystical. It was the result of decades of careful observation combined with an intuitive understanding of how animals processed information. He had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated stress, illness, or fear in livestock, and his solutions were usually simple adjustments to environment, diet, or handling techniques. When Ed Baker's prize bulls suddenly stopped breeding, veterinarians had run expensive tests and found nothing wrong. Jake spent an afternoon watching the animal and noticed that the bull seemed nervous around a new piece of equipment that had been installed near the breeding pen. Moving the equipment solved the problem immediately. Frank Henderson had called Jake when his horses began refusing to cross a particular creek that they had used for years without hesitation. Local veterinarians suggested everything from vision problems to mineral deficiencies. But Jake discovered that a recent flash flood had shifted rocks in the creek bed, creating an unstable footing that the horses could sense, but humans couldn't. Detect a few hours with a shovel fixed the crossing, and the horses resumed their normal behavior immediately. These successes had built Jake's reputation as someone who could solve problems that stumped others. But they had also created expectations that he sometimes found burdensome, and when neighbors called for help, Jake felt obligated to respond. Even when his own work suffered, Sarah had often teased him about being the horse whisperer of Pine Valley. But she had also understood that his reputation was an important part of the ranch's standing in the community. At 58, Jake Morrison had achieved something that eluded many people: complete satisfaction with the life he had chosen. He owned his land outright, debt-free, except for normal operating expenses. His cattle were healthy and profitable. His reputation in the community was solid and earned through decades of consistent performance. The Circle M generated enough income to maintain the operation, pay Jake a modest salary, and set aside money for equipment replacement and emergencies. Jake lived simply. His biggest expenses were veterinary care for the cattle, fuel for equipment, and the occasional equipment purchase. His house was paid for, his vehicles were older but reliable, and his entertainment consisted mainly of reading, listening to music, and the deep satisfaction that came from watching his animals thrive. Jake's bookshelf reflected the interests of a man who understood that learning never stopped. Veterinary manuals sat next to histories of the American West. Books about grass management and soil conservation were mixed with biographies of successful ranchers and entrepreneurs. Jake read constantly, always looking for new ideas that might improve his operation or help him understand the broader economic forces that affected agriculture. Financial security wasn't Jake's primary goal. He was more interested in sustainability and stewardship. He wanted to pass the Circle M to the next generation in better condition than he had inherited it, with improved soil, better genetics in the cattle herd, and updated infrastructure that would serve the ranch for decades to come. Jake's 12 horses were more than just tools for ranch work. They were partners whose instincts and intelligence had been essential to the Circle M's success for 3 decades. Each horse had been carefully selected for specific traits: intelligence, athleticism, temperament, and the indefinable quality that made a good ranch horse. Red, the big sorrel gelding, served as Jake's primary riding horse. At 15 years old, Red had the experience and steadiness that made him perfect for long days checking cattle in rough terrain. Red could navigate rocky slopes that would challenge a mountain goat, and his calm temperament made him ideal for working around machinery or in situations that might spook younger horses. Patches, the paint mare, was Jake's cutting horse, the animal he used when he needed to separate individual cattle from the herd. Patches seemed to understand cattle psychology better than most humans, anticipating which way a cow would move and positioning herself accordingly. She was quick, agile, and absolutely fearless when working in the middle of a herd of 1,000-pound animals. Senator, the old bay gelding, was approaching retirement at 22, but his calm demeanor made him perfect for training younger horses or for tasks that required absolute steadiness. Senator could stand motionless while Jake performed veterinary procedures on cattle, and his presence seemed to calm other animals in stressful situations. The younger horses, including a promising 3-year-old quarter horse named Blaze and a 4-year-old mare called Star, were still learning their roles in the ranch operation. Jake spent hours working with these animals, teaching them to respond to subtle cues and developing the trust that was essential for safe, effective ranch work. The relationship between Jake and his horses went far beyond the mechanical interaction of rider and mount. These animals had learned to read Jake's intentions through subtle shifts in posture and pressure, while Jake had developed an almost telepathic understanding of what his horses were thinking and feeling. This mutual trust had developed through thousands of hours of shared work in conditions that ranged from comfortable to dangerous. Jake's horses had carried him through blizzards when visibility dropped to 0, across swollen creeks during spring runoff, and up mountain slopes where a single misstep could be fatal. In return, Jake had learned to trust his horse's instincts about terrain, weather, and potential dangers. When Red tensed his muscles in a particular way, Jake knew to look for snakes or other ground hazards. When Patch's ears moved in a specific pattern, Jake understood that she had spotted cattle that he hadn't yet seen. This level of communication required complete mutual respect and understanding that had been built over years of consistent, patient work. The horses had saved Jake from serious injury on multiple occasions. Red had refused to step into what looked like solid ground. It was actually a hidden washout that could have resulted in a serious fall. Patches had alerted Jake to a rattlesnake coiled in tall grass by suddenly stopping and backing away from an area that looked perfectly safe. Senator had somehow sensed an approaching lightning storm 20 minutes before the first thunder. Giving Jake time to seek shelter, This trust in his horse's judgment had become so fundamental to Jake's approach to ranch work that he rarely questioned their instincts. When a horse acted nervous or reluctant in a particular area, Jake's first assumption was that the animal had detected something that human senses couldn't perceive. This attitude would prove crucial when his horses began exhibiting strange behavior around a specific section of the ranch. The 2,400 acres of the Circle M Ranch encompassed a remarkable variety of terrain. From flat grassland perfect for cattle grazing to rocky outcroppings that provided shelter during storms. The property included 2 year-round creeks, several seasonal water sources, and elevation changes that created microclimates supporting different types of vegetation. Jake knew every significant feature of his property, where the best grass grew during dry years, which areas provided natural windbreaks during winter storms, where cattle liked to gather during different seasons. This intimate knowledge had been passed down from his father and grandfather, supplemented by his own 3 decades of daily observation. The ranch's location had always been strategic. The original homestead had been positioned to take advantage of multiple water sources and natural shelter, while providing easy access to different types of grazing. The property boundaries had been expanded over the generations to include the most productive land while avoiding areas that were too steep, rocky, or prone to flooding. Like most properties in the region, the Circle M showed evidence of previous human activity dating back over a century. Old fence lines marked boundaries that had been changed as the ranch expanded. Foundation stones revealed the locations of buildings that had been torn down or had collapsed over time. Scattered pieces of rusted equipment told stories of past attempts to work the land. But there was one section of the property, a roughly 40-acre area in the south pasture, that had always seemed slightly different from the rest. The grass grew a bit differently there, and cattle sometimes seemed reluctant to graze in that particular area for extended periods. Jake had never given it much thought. Every piece of land had its own characteristics, and subtle variations were normal on a property as large as the Circle M. On this particular evening in late September, as Jake Morrison completed his final check of the horses and cattle, everything seemed exactly as it had for the past 32 years. The cattle were content in their pasture, the horses were relaxed and healthy, and the ranch was generating the steady, modest income that had sustained for generations of the Morrison family. Jake had no reason to expect that his quiet, predictable life was about to become the center of one of the most extraordinary discoveries in Colorado history. He had no way of knowing that a mystery dating back to World War II had been waiting beneath his feet for over 70 years, or that his horse's instincts were about to lead him to a treasure that would transform not just his own life, but his understanding of the land his family had worked for generations. As he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and watched the stars emerge in the clear Colorado sky, Jake Morrison was simply a successful rancher, enjoying the deep satisfaction of a life lived in harmony with the land and the animals he understood so well. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same rewarding routine he had followed for 3 decades. But sometimes, the most ordinary days are followed by the most extraordinary discoveries. And sometimes, the animals we trust most are trying to tell us something that will change our lives forever. October arrived at the Circle M Ranch with the kind of crisp, clear mornings that reminded Jake Morrison why he had never wanted to live anywhere else. The aspen trees in the higher elevations had turned their brilliant gold, creating a spectacular backdrop against the evergreen forests and snow-dusted peaks. The cattle were healthy and fat from a summer of good grazing, and Jake was already making plans for the fall roundup that would bring the herd down from the high pastures, for winter weather made the mountain trails impassable. It was on a Tuesday morning, October 3rd, that Jake first noticed something unusual about his horse's behavior. He had been planning to move a group of cattle from the east pasture to a section of the south pasture that had been resting since early summer. The grass there had recovered beautifully, and Jake knew the cattle would thrive on the nutritious feed before winter set in. Narrator Jake's morning routine had been exactly the same for 3 decades. After coffee and a quick check of weather conditions, he would walk to the horse pasture, whistle for Red, and begin preparing for whatever ranch work the day required. But on this particular morning, something felt different from the moment he stepped outside. The horses were gathered at the far end of their pasture, bunched together in a way that immediately caught Jake's attention. Normally, the 12 animals would be spread across the 20-acre enclosure, some grazing, others resting. A few investigating the fence line for any grass that might be greener on the other side. This tight clustering was unusual behavior that suggested the animals were nervous or uncomfortable about something. Jake whistled his usual call for Red, expecting the big sorrel gelding to lift his head and amble over to the gate. Instead, Red raised his head, looked directly at Jake, but remained motionless. The other horses seemed equally unresponsive to Jake's presence, which was completely unprecedented in the 15 years he had owned most of these animals. "Easy, boys," Jake called softly as he approached the group. "What's got you all spooked?" As he got closer, Jake could see that the horses weren't just nervous, they were actively alert. With their ears pricked forward and their attention focused on something beyond the fence line, following their gaze, Jake looked toward the south pasture, the area where he had planned to move cattle later that morning. The south pasture looked exactly as it had for the past 32 years, rolling grassland dotted with a few scattered rocks and the occasional small tree. There were no visible threats, no unusual sounds, nothing that should have caused his usually calm horses to behave so strangely. Jake spent 20 minutes trying to approach Red and the other horses, but every time he got within 10 feet of the group, they would move away, maintaining their distance while keeping their attention focused on the south pasture. This behavior was so completely foreign to everything Jake knew about his animals that he began to question whether they might be ill or suffering from some kind of poisoning. Finally, Jake decided to saddle Blaze, the young quarter horse who was still learning ranch work, but had always been eager to please. Even Blaze seemed reluctant to be caught, but Jake eventually managed to get a halter on the animal and lead him to the barn for saddling. As Jake worked with the familiar routine of brushing and saddling his horse, he tried to make sense of what he had observed. In 32 years of ranch work, he had seen horses react to approaching storms, wild animals and mechanical noises, but he had never seen them display this kind of sustained, focused attention on an apparently empty pasture. The cattle tell the same story with Blaze saddled and ready. Jake rode toward the east pasture to begin gathering the cattle he planned to move. The morning was perfect for ranch work, cool enough to be comfortable, with no wind and excellent visibility across the rolling landscape. Under normal circumstances, Jake would have been looking forward to a productive day of cattle management. But as he approached the herd, Jake noticed that the cattle were displaying behavior patterns that were almost as unusual as those he had observed in the horses. The 43 head of cattle in the east pasture were all positioned along the north and east fence lines, as far from the south pasture as they could get, while remaining within their designated grazing area. Narrator. Cattle are creatures of habit and routine, but they're also remarkably sensitive to environmental changes that humans often miss. Jake had learned to read cattle behavior as a reliable indicator of everything from weather patterns to the presence of predators. What he was seeing now didn't fit any pattern he had encountered in 3 decades of ranching. Jake rode among the cattle, checking their condition and looking for any signs of illness or distress. The animals appeared healthy and well-fed, but they were definitely agitated. Several of the older cows kept looking toward the south, and when Jake tried to move them in that direction, they resisted with unusual stubbornness. Cattle can be difficult to move under the best circumstances, but Jake's herd had been trained to respond to gentle pressure and consistent handling. These animals knew Jake's voice and trusted his guidance, which made their resistance even more puzzling. When he positioned Blaze to encourage the cattle toward the south pasture, the entire herd moved away from him, something that had never happened before. After an hour of unsuccessful attempts to move even a single animal toward the south pasture, Jake decided to abandon his original plan and simply observe the cattle's behavior more carefully. What he discovered was both fascinating and troubling. The cattle would graze normally anywhere in the east pasture except along the south fence line. When individual animals wandered too close to that boundary, they would suddenly stop, raise their heads, and back away.
Ow.
Young calves stayed close to their mothers instead of exploring as they normally would. The herd bull, a massive animal that Jake had paid $15,000 for 3 years earlier, positioned himself between the south fence and the rest of the herd, as if he were protecting them from some invisible threat. Jake had seen cattle react to the scent of predators, but there were no large predators in the area. The last mountain lion had been spotted over 50 miles away, and wolves hadn't been seen in Pine Valley for over a century. He had seen cattle avoid areas where they had been frightened by loud noises or unusual activity, but the south pasture had been empty and quiet for months. That afternoon, Jake drove to Ed Baker's ranch to discuss what he had observed. Ed had been ranching in Pine Valley for almost as long as Jake. His practical approach to problem solving had helped Jake through several difficult situations over the years. If anyone could help explain the strange behavior of Jake's animals, it would be Ed. Ed Baker was working on a tractor engine when Jake pulled into his driveway. 61, Ed still did most of his own mechanical work, partly from necessity and partly from the satisfaction that came from fixing things with his own hands. He looked up from the engine compartment with the grease-stained smile of a man who enjoyed a good puzzle. "Jake," Ed called out, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "Brings you over here in the middle of the week?" Jake explained what he had observed that morning, describing the behavior of both his horses and cattle in careful detail. Ed listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as Jake continued his account. Narrator Ed. Baker had spent 40 years observing animal behavior on his own ranch and had developed a reputation for understanding livestock psychology that rivaled Jake's own expertise. If anyone could provide insight into what Jake had witnessed, it would be Ed. "That's peculiar, all right," Ed said when Jake finished his description. "How long has this been going on?" "Just noticed it this morning," Jake replied. But the way they were acting, it seemed like they'd been avoiding that area for a while. "I just hadn't paid attention because I wasn't planning to use that pasture until today." Ed scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Any chance you've got a gas leak or something chemical out there? Sometimes animals can smell things we can't detect." "I thought about that," Jake said. "But there's no gas lines running through that area, and I haven't used any chemicals on that pasture in over 2 years. What about underground activity? Sometimes animals can hear or feel vibrations from mining operations or construction that's happening miles away." Jake shook his head. "Nothing like that going on anywhere in the valley. I checked with the county this morning. Ed suggested they drive over to take a look at the south pasture together. 2 sets of experienced eyes might spot something that one person had missed." Jake readily agreed, and within 20 minutes they were standing at the fence line between the east and south pastures, looking across the grassland that had somehow become a source of fear for Jake's animals. To human senses, the south pasture appeared completely normal. The grass was thick and healthy, growing in the irregular patterns that indicated good soil and adequate moisture. There were no unusual odors, no visible disturbances in the soil, no signs of recent activity by humans or wild animals. A few scattered rocks broke up the gentle rolling terrain, but these were the same granite outcroppings that could be found throughout the region. "Looks fine to me," Ed admitted after a thorough visual inspection. "Yeah, but I've learned to trust animal instincts when they're this consistent. If all your horses and cattle are avoiding this area, there's got to be a reason." The 2 men walked along the fence line for nearly a quarter mile, examining the ground for any signs that might explain the animals' behavior. They found nothing unusual, no disturbed earth, no unusual vegetation patterns, no evidence of recent nor seen digging or construction activity, Ed said as they completed their inspection. "I've heard stories about animals acting strange before earthquakes or other geological events. We should call the Geological Survey and see if there's been any seismic activity in the area." Jake made a mental note to contact the U.S. Geological Survey, though he doubted that minor seismic activity would cause such a dramatic behavioral change in animals that had lived on the property for years. Over the next 3 days, the strange behavior of Jake's animals not only continued, but seemed to intensify. The horses remained clustered at the far end of their pasture, and attempts to work cattle anywhere near the south pasture proved futile. Jake found himself adapting his daily routines around his animals' mysterious aversion to an area that had been part of their normal grazing rotation for years. On Friday morning, Jake decided to conduct a more systematic investigation. He saddled Senator, his oldest and most reliable horse, hoping that the animal's calm temperament might make him less susceptible to whatever was affecting the other horses. If he could ride Senator into the south pasture and conduct a thorough examination of the area, he might discover some clue that had escaped notice during his earlier inspections. Narrator: Senator had been Jake's most trusted mount for over 15 years, carrying him safely through blizzards, lightning storms, and encounters with wild animals. If any horse could overcome whatever was causing the strange behavior, it would be the steady old bay gelding who had never shown fear of anything. But even Senator seemed reluctant to approach the south pasture. As they rode along the fence line, Jake could feel the horse's muscles tense and his gait become increasingly choppy. When Jake turned Senator toward the gate that led into the south pasture, the horse stopped completely and refused to move forward despite Jake's gentle encouragement. "Come on, old boy," Jake said softly, patting Senator's neck. "There's nothing there that can hurt us." Senator's response was to back away from the gate, something the well-trained horse had never done before. Riding parallel to the fence, approaching from different angles, even dismounting and trying to lead Senator through the gate. Nothing worked. The horse that had never refused a reasonable request from his rider was adamant about avoiding the south pasture. Jake's frustration was building, but it was tempered by a growing respect for his animal's instincts. These horses and cattle had lived on the Circle M for years, and their behavior had always been reliable and predictable. If they were all avoiding the same area with such consistency, there had to be a logical explanation. That afternoon, Jake called Dr. Helen Morrison, no relation, the veterinarian who had been caring for his animals since Sarah's death. Dr. Morrison had over 20 years of experience with large animals and had developed a reputation for solving behavioral problems that stumped other veterinarians. "Jake," Dr. Morrison said when she arrived at the ranch 2 hours later, "Ed Baker called me yesterday and mentioned you were having some unusual behavior issues with your animals. What exactly are we dealing with?" Jake walked Dr. Morrison through the same observations he had shared with Ed Baker, then took her to observe the animals firsthand. Dr. Morrison spent over an hour watching the horses and cattle, taking notes, and asking detailed questions about when the behavior had started and whether Jake had noticed any other changes in the animals' routines. "This is definitely unusual," Dr. Morrison admitted as they concluded their observation session. "The consistency of the behavior across different species suggests they're responding to some kind of environmental stimulus. Have you considered having the soil tested for contamination?" Jake had been thinking about soil testing, but wasn't sure how to proceed. Dr. Morrison recommended a laboratory in Denver that specialized in agricultural soil analysis and could test for everything from chemical contamination to naturally occurring minerals that might affect animal behavior. In the meantime, Dr. Morrison suggested, "I'd recommend keeping your animals away from that area until we figure out what's going on. Animal instincts are usually right about these things, even when we can't understand what they're detecting." The weekend brought an early winter storm that dumped 6 inches of snow across the Pine Valley and temporarily changed Jake's priorities. From investigating animal behavior to ensuring that his cattle and horses had adequate shelter and food, the storm also provided an unexpected opportunity to observe his animals' behavior under different conditions. With snow covering the landscape, the visual boundaries between different pastures became less distinct, but the animals' behavior remained exactly the same. The horses stayed clustered in the far corner of their enclosure, and the cattle continued to avoid the area near the south pasture fence line. Jake had hoped that the storm might somehow reset his animals' behavior patterns, the way a change in weather sometimes helped resolve other unexplained problems on the ranch. Instead, the consistency of their avoidance behavior convinced him that whatever was affecting his animals was serious enough to override their normal responses to weather and mental changes. During the 3 days of snow and cold weather, Jake spent considerable time in his ranch office, using his computer to research animal behavior patterns and possible explanations for what he was observing. The internet provided access to veterinary journals, agricultural extension service publications, and discussion forums where ranchers shared experiences with unusual animal behavior. What Jake discovered was both reassuring and troubling. There were documented cases of animals detecting underground gas leaks, mineral deposits, and even archaeological sites before humans became aware of them. Animals had been known to avoid areas where earthquakes would later occur. Some species could detect magnetic field variations that humans couldn't perceive. But Jake also learned that sudden, dramatic changes in animal behavior sometimes indicated serious environmental problems. Animals had avoided areas contaminated with toxic chemicals, abandoned mine sites with dangerous underground structures, locations where underground utilities had been damaged in ways that created invisible hazards. The more Jake read, the more convinced he became that his animals were trying to communicate something important about the South Pasture. The question was whether that something represented a danger to be avoided or an opportunity to be investigated. On Monday morning, with the storm past and roads clear, Jake began implementing a systematic approach to understanding his animals' behavior. His first step was collecting soil samples from the South Pasture for laboratory analysis. Using a soil auger borrowed from the county extension office, Jake collected samples from 12 different locations across the 40-acre area. The process was more complex than Jake had anticipated. The laboratory required samples from different depths, careful labeling of each collection site, and detailed documentation of soil conditions and recent land use. Jake spent the entire morning collecting samples according to the laboratory specifications, mapping each collection site with GPS coordinates for future reference. Jake had never considered himself particularly scientific in his approach to ranching, preferring to rely on experience and intuition. But his animals' unprecedented behavior had convinced him that this situation required a more methodical investigation than his usual problem-solving methods. While waiting for soil test results, Jake decided to expand his research into the history of the South Pasture. He drove to the Pine Valley Historical Society, housed in a converted bank building on Main Street, to search for any information about previous use of his property. The Historical Society's archives contained property records, old maps, and newspaper clippings. Dating back to the town's founding in 1882, Jake spent several hours reviewing documents related to his property, learning details about the land's history that had been forgotten by his family over the generations. The most interesting discovery was a 1943 newspaper article about military training exercises that had been conducted in the Pine Valley area during World War II. The article was brief and contained few details, but it mentioned that the Army Air Corps had used several ranch properties in the region for navigation training and emergency landing practice. Jake had never heard any family stories about military activity on the Circle M during the war, but that didn't mean it hadn't happened. His grandfather Thomas would have been running the ranch in 1943, and Jake realized that there might be family documents or photographs that could provide more information about wartime activities on the property back at the ranch house. Jake spent the evening searching through boxes of family papers that had been stored in the attic for decades. Most of the documents related to routine ranch business, cattle sales, equipment purchases, tax records, but buried in a box of photographs from the 1940s. Jake found something interesting. Several black and white photographs showed military vehicles parked near the ranch house, with soldiers in uniform standing alongside Jake's grandfather, Thomas. One photograph was dated July 1943, in his grandfather's handwriting, and showed what appeared to be a large military truck or transport vehicle in the background. The photographs raised more questions than they answered, but they confirmed that there had been some kind of military presence on the Circle M during World War II. Jake made a mental note to contact the National Archives to see if they had any records of military activities in the Pine Valley area during the war years. On Tuesday afternoon, Jake received a call from Dr. Sarah Chen, a soil scientist at Colorado State University who had reviewed his soil samples. Dr. Chen's findings were puzzling and inconclusive. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Chen explained over the phone, "we've completed our analysis of your soil samples, and I have to say, the results are quite interesting. The soil chemistry is perfectly normal for your region. No contamination, no unusual mineral concentrations, no evidence of chemical spills or industrial activity." Jake felt both relieved and frustrated. So there's nothing wrong with the soil. That would explain why my animals are avoiding that area? Not according to our standard tests, Dr. Chen replied. But there's something unusual that might be worth investigating further. Several of your samples contain small metallic fragments that don't appear to be naturally occurring. They're too small and too scattered to represent a significant contamination issue. But they're definitely not typical of agricultural soil. The metallic fragments were microscopic, Dr. Chen explained, but they appeared to be composed of aluminum and other metals commonly used in aerospace applications. The fragments were distributed throughout the soil at various depths, suggesting they had been there for a considerable time. Dr. Chen, Jake asked, could these metal fragments be detected by animals even if humans can't sense them? It's possible, Dr. Chen admitted. Animals often have much more sensitive detection capabilities than humans. Some species can detect magnetic fields, unusual odors, or even subtle vibrations that we can't perceive. If there's a large source of metal buried in that area, animals might be able to sense it in ways that our standard soil tests wouldn't reveal. Dr. Chen recommended that Jake consider having the area surveyed with metal detection equipment or ground-penetrating radar to determine if there was a significant metallic object buried beneath the south pasture. She provided contact information for a geological survey company in Denver that specialized in subsurface investigations. That evening, as Jake sat in his kitchen reviewing everything he had learned over the past week, he realized that his investigation had raised more questions than it had answered. His animals were avoiding an area that appeared perfectly normal to human senses. But soil analysis had revealed microscopic metal fragments that might indicate something buried beneath the surface. The historical research had confirmed that there had been military activity on his property during World War II. But family records provided no details about the nature or extent of that activity. The photographs showed military vehicles on the ranch, but Jake couldn't determine whether they had been passing through or conducting specific operations in the south pasture. Jake Morrison had spent his entire adult life solving problems through practical experience and common-sense approaches. But the mystery of his animals' behavior was proving more complex than anything he had encountered in 32 years of ranching. Every answer seemed to lead to new questions, and every investigation revealed additional layers of complexity. Jake's phone rang just as he was preparing for bed. The caller was Tom Reeves, the youngest member of the Tuesday morning coffee group at Maggie's Cafe. Tom said, "I've been thinking about what you told us last week about your animals acting strange. I've been doing some research on the internet, and I found something you might be interested in." Tom had discovered a website maintained by aviation historians who documented military aircraft accidents during World War II. According to the site, several military transport planes had crashed in Colorado during the war years, often while carrying classified cargo or conducting secret missions. Most of these crashes were never publicized during the war, Tom explained. The military kept them classified for security reasons, and some of the crash sites were never fully investigated or cleaned up after the war ended. 2. At least 3 aircraft crashes in Colorado that had never been completely resolved cases, where aircraft had disappeared during flights and were presumed to have crashed in remote areas where search and rescue operations had been unsuccessful. "I'm probably reaching here," Tom continued, "but what if one of those planes went down on your property? That would explain the metal fragments in your soil, and it might explain why your animals are acting strange. Animals can sometimes sense things about burial sites that humans can't detect." Jake thanked Tom for the information and promised to follow up on the aviation history research. As he hung up the phone, Jake realized that his investigation was beginning to point toward a possibility he had never considered. There might be something significant buried beneath his south pasture, something that had been there for over 70 years without his family's knowledge. The mystery was no longer just about unusual animal behavior. It was becoming a quest to uncover a piece of history that might have been hidden beneath the Circle M Ranch since World War II. Jake spent a restless night thinking about everything he had learned and trying to decide how to proceed. His animals were clearly trying to tell him something about the south pasture. The scientific evidence suggested that there might be a large metallic object buried in that area. The historical research had confirmed military activity on his property during the war. and Tom's research had revealed that several military aircraft had crashed in Colorado during the 1940s without being recovered. The logical next step would be to hire a professional survey company to conduct a thorough subsurface investigation of the South Pasture. But such an investigation would be expensive, and there was no guarantee that it would reveal anything significant. Jake was a practical man who had built his success on careful resource management and avoiding unnecessary risks. On the other hand, Jake had learned to trust his animals' instincts, and their behavior was so unprecedented that it demanded a serious response. Where there was something buried on his property, whether it was a crashed aircraft, buried military equipment, or something else entirely, Jake felt a responsibility to investigate. As dawn broke over the Circle M ranch, Jake Morrison stood at his kitchen window looking out toward the South Pasture that had become the center of an increasingly complex mystery. In just 1 week, his quiet, predictable life had been disrupted by questions that challenged everything he thought he knew about his own land. Jake made his decision as he watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold and pink. He would hire a professional survey company to conduct a thorough investigation of the South Pasture. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, he needed to understand what his animals were trying to tell him. The phone call to Denver Geological Survey would have to wait until business hours, but Jake knew that by the end of the day, he would have committed to an investigation that might change everything about his understanding of the Circle M ranch. He was about to take the first step toward uncovering a secret that had been hidden beneath his feet for over 70 years. Little did Jake know that this decision would lead him to one of the most extraordinary discoveries in Colorado history, and that his trust in his animals' instincts would soon prove to be the wisest choice he had ever made. The mystery of the South Pasture was about to become much larger and more significant than anyone could have imagined. Jake Morrison made the call to Denver Geological Survey at exactly 8 a.m. on Wednesday morning. After spending the previous evening calculating and recalculating the potential cost of a professional subsurface investigation, the company's receptionist transferred him to Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a geophysicist who specialized in ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry surveys. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Rodriguez said after Jake explained his situation, "What you're describing sounds like it could definitely warrant a subsurface investigation. The combination of consistent animal avoidance behavior and microscopic metal fragments in the soil suggests there could be a significant metallic object buried in that area." Dr. Rodriguez explained that a comprehensive survey of the 40-acre South Pasture would require multiple technologies. Ground-penetrating radar could detect large objects buried up to 20 feet deep, while magnetometry could identify metallic objects at much greater depths. The combination would provide a detailed picture of anything unusual beneath the surface. The cost estimate made Jake's stomach clench. A thorough survey would run between $12,000 and $15,000, depending on how much detail was required and how many anomalies they discovered. For a ranch that generated a modest but steady income, this represented a significant financial risk. Dr. Rodriguez, Jake asked, "What are the chances that you'd find something significant enough to justify that cost?" "Based on what you've described, I'd say there's a better than average chance we'll find something interesting," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "The animal behavior you're describing is often a reliable indicator of subsurface anomalies. Animals can detect magnetic field variations, subtle ground vibrations, and other phenomena that humans can't perceive." Jake spent 2 hours on the phone with Dr. Rodriguez, discussing the logistics of the survey and trying to understand exactly what they would be looking for. The conversation convinced him that the investigation was worth pursuing, despite the cost. If there was something significant buried on his property, he needed to know what it was. Dr. Rodriguez and his team arrived at the Circle M ranch the following Monday morning in 2 vehicles loaded with sophisticated electronic equipment. The team consisted of Dr. Rodriguez, a graduate student named Sarah Kim, who operated the ground-penetrating radar equipment, and a technician named Carlos Mendez, who handled the magnetometry surveys. Jake watched with fascination as the team unloaded equipment that looked more appropriate for a space mission than a ranch investigation. The ground-penetrating radar unit resembled a sophisticated lawnmower, while the magnetometer looked like a metal detector designed by rocket scientists. The first step is establishing a grid system across your south pasture, Dr. Rodriguez explained as his team began setting up their equipment. We'll survey the entire 40 acres in systematic passes, recording data every few feet.
The process
Will take about 3 days, if weather cooperates. Jake's horses and cattle maintained their distance from the south pasture, even with the survey team working in the area. The animals watched the proceedings from their usual positions at the far edges of their respective enclosures, as if they were curious about the investigation, but unwilling to get any closer to whatever had been making them nervous. The first day of surveying produced results that exceeded everyone's expectations. By noon, Sarah Kim had identified 3 distinct anomalies with the ground-penetrating radar, all located in roughly the same area of the south pasture. The anomalies appeared to be large, metallic objects buried at depths ranging from 8 to 12 feet. This is definitely not normal geological formation, Sarah announced as she reviewed the radar data on her laptop computer. These objects are clearly artificial, and they're substantial enough to have been buried intentionally or to represent something that crashed and was subsequently covered by decades of soil accumulation. The magnetometry survey conducted by Carlos Mendez provided even more dramatic results. His equipment detected magnetic field disturbances that suggested the presence of a very large metallic object buried at a depth of approximately 10 feet. The magnetic signature was consistent with aircraft aluminum and steel, though Carlos was careful to note that other explanations were possible. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Rodriguez said as the team concluded their first day of work, "I've been doing this kind of survey work for 15 years, and I've never seen readings quite like these. There's definitely something substantial buried in this pasture, something big enough and metallic enough to create significant subsurface anomalies." Jake felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension as he reviewed the preliminary survey results. The investigation was confirming his animal's instincts and validating his decision to hire professional help. But it was also opening up questions that he wasn't sure he was prepared to answer. Dr. Rodriguez recommended expanding the survey to include areas adjacent to the south pasture to determine the full extent of whatever was buried there. This additional work would add another $5,000 to the cost of the investigation. But Jake agreed without hesitation. He had come too far to stop now, and the initial results were too compelling to ignore. The expanded survey revealed that the anomalies extended beyond the boundaries of the south pasture into an adjacent area that Jake had always used for hay production. The buried object appeared to be much larger than anyone had initially suspected, possibly extending across an area of 60 to 80 acres. "This is starting to look like a very large aircraft," Dr. Rodriguez admitted as he reviewed the complete survey data. The size and shape of the magnetic anomaly is consistent with a military transport plane from the World War II era, possibly a C-47 or something similar.
Ow.
Jake had been researching World War II military aircraft since Tom Reeves had first suggested the possibility of a plane crash on his property. C-47 transport planes had been workhorses of the wartime military, used for everything from troop transport to cargo hauling to classified missions that remained secret decades after the war ended. The possibility that a C-47 had crashed on his property and remained undiscovered for over 70 years seemed almost incredible. But the survey data was difficult to argue with. The magnetic signature, the size of the anomaly, and the depth of burial all suggested that something very significant was hidden beneath. The Circle M Ranch. Dr. Rodriguez's team spent 2 additional days refining their survey data and creating detailed maps of the subsurface anomalies. The final report included computer-generated images that showed the probable outline of the buried object, along with recommendations for excavation procedures if Jake decided to proceed with actually uncovering whatever was buried there. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Rodriguez said as he presented the final survey results, "I have to tell you that this is one of the most significant subsurface anomalies I've ever documented. If this is indeed a crashed aircraft, it could represent an important piece of military history. But I also have to warn you that excavating something this large and potentially significant would be a major undertaking." The survey had cost Jake $17,000, nearly exhausting his ranch's operating budget for the year. but the results had provided compelling evidence that there was something extraordinary buried on his property, something that had been affecting his animals' behavior and might represent a significant historical discovery. Jake spent that evening studying the survey reports and trying to decide how to proceed. The logical next step would be to begin excavation work to determine exactly what was buried in the south pasture. But such an excavation would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially complicated by legal and regulatory issues. Jake's first call the following morning was to Rebecca Martinez, a lawyer in Colorado Springs who specialized in property law and had handled legal issues for several ranchers in the Pine Valley area. Jake explained the situation and asked about his legal rights and responsibilities regarding anything that might be discovered on his property. Rebecca said after reviewing the survey reports, "This situation could be more complex than you realize. If there's a military aircraft buried on your property, there could be federal jurisdiction issues, historical preservation requirements, and potentially even national security considerations." Rebecca explained that military aircraft, even those that had been missing for decades, technically remained property of the federal government. If Jake's investigation had uncovered a crashed military plane, he would be required to notify appropriate federal authorities before proceeding with any excavation work. "The good news," Rebecca continued, "is that you're not prohibited from investigating your own property. But if you do find evidence of a military aircraft, you'll need to follow specific procedures for reporting the discovery and working with federal agencies to determine how to proceed." Rebecca recommended that Jake contact the Air Force History Office and the Defense Department's Office for POWMIA Affairs to report his findings and request guidance on how to proceed. These agencies had experience dealing with discoveries of lost military aircraft and could provide advice on proper procedures for excavation and investigation. Jake also learned that if the buried aircraft contained human remains, the excavation would become a formal military recovery operation with extensive federal oversight. Such operations could take months or even years to complete and would involve teams of military personnel, forensic specialists, and historians. The legal complexities were daunting, but Rebecca assured Jake property owners who reported discoveries of military aircraft were typically treated as partners in the investigation, rather than obstacles. The federal government had a strong interest in recovering lost aircraft and honoring military personnel who had died in service. Property owners who cooperated with such efforts were generally compensated for their costs and inconvenience. Jake made the required notifications to federal authorities that afternoon, submitting copies of the Geological survey reports and requesting guidance on how to proceed. The response was swift and professional. Within 24 hours, Jake received calls from the Air Force History Office, the Defense Department, and the FBI's Evidence Recovery Team. Major Lisa Thompson from the Air Force History Office explained that Jake's discovery was potentially very significant. Several military transport aircraft had been lost in Colorado during World War II, and the Air Force had been hoping to locate and recover these aircraft for decades. "Mr. Morrison," Major Thompson said, "if your survey has located one of our missing aircraft, this could be an extremely important historical discovery. We'd like to send a team to your ranch to conduct our own investigation and determine the best way to proceed. The federal investigation would be conducted at government expense," Major Thompson explained, "and Jake would be compensated for any costs he had already incurred in any disruption to his ranch operations. If the investigation confirmed the presence of a military aircraft, the recovery operation would be treated as a formal military mission with appropriate ceremony and recognition." The federal investigation team arrived at the Circle M Ranch 1 week later in a convoy of government vehicles that transformed Jake's quiet ranch into what looked like a military base. The team included Air Force historians, FBI evidence specialists, Army Corps of Engineers, personnel, and representatives from the Defense Department's POWMIA office. Colonel James Mitchell, the team leader, was a career Air Force officer who had participated in aircraft recovery operations around the world. He explained to Jake that the federal government took these investigations very seriously, both as a matter of historical preservation and as a way of honoring military personnel who had made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. Mr. Morrison, Colonel Mitchell said as his team began setting up their equipment. "We appreciate your cooperation in reporting this discovery. Property owners like yourself are essential partners in our efforts to locate and recover missing military aircraft and personnel." The federal team brought much more sophisticated equipment than Dr. Rodriguez's Geological survey company had. Used, their ground-penetrating radar could produce detailed three-dimensional images of buried objects, while their magnetometry equipment could detect metallic objects buried at depths of up to 50 feet. The federal survey confirmed and expanded upon Dr. Rodriguez's findings. The buried object was definitely a large aircraft, probably a C-47 transport plane, lying on its side at a depth of approximately 10 feet. The aircraft appeared to be largely intact, suggesting that it had crashed and been quickly covered by soil rather than burning or exploding on impact. More significantly, the federal survey detected what appeared to be a large cargo compartment within the aircraft that showed unusual density readings. Colonel Mitchell explained that such readings sometimes indicated the presence of heavy cargo that had survived the crash intact. "We've seen cases where military transport aircraft were carrying gold, silver, or other valuable cargo when they crashed," Colonel Mitchell told Jake. "During World War II, military aircraft were sometimes used to transport precious metals, currency, and other high-value items for various classified purposes. The possibility that the crashed aircraft contained valuable cargo added another layer of complexity to the investigation. If the plane had been carrying gold or other precious metals, the recovery operation would require additional security measures and specialized handling procedures." Jake found himself at the center of what was rapidly becoming a major federal investigation. His ranch was crawling with government personnel, and his phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters who had somehow learned about the discovery. The quiet life he had enjoyed for 32 years was being disrupted in ways he had never imagined. Despite the federal team's efforts to maintain secrecy, word of the investigation leaked to the media. Within days of the team's arrival at the Circle M ranch, Jake's first indication that the story had become public was a phone call from a reporter with the Denver Post who wanted to interview him about the crashed military plane filled with gold that had supposedly been discovered on his property. Jake had no idea how the reporter had learned about the investigation, but he quickly discovered that keeping secrets in a small community like Pine Valley was nearly impossible. Someone had seen the convoy of government vehicles heading to his ranch. Someone else had overheard a conversation at Maggie's Cafe, and within hours the story was spreading through social media and local news outlets. The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. Jake's phone rang constantly with interview requests from newspapers, television stations, and online publications. Reporters began showing up at his gate uninvited, hoping to get photographs of the investigation site or interviews with the man who had discovered a treasure plane on his ranch. Colonel Mitchell called an emergency meeting with Jake to discuss how to handle the media attention. The federal investigation was still in its preliminary stages, and premature publicity could complicate the recovery operation and potentially compromise security. If the aircraft did indeed contain valuable cargo, Mr. Morrison, Colonel Mitchell, said, "We need to establish some ground rules for dealing with the media. Can't stop them from reporting on the investigation, but we can control what information is released and when." Jake agreed to refer all media inquiries to the Air Force Public Affairs Office, which would handle press releases and coordinate any interviews or press conferences. In return, the federal team would keep Jake informed about all developments in the investigation and ensure that he was recognized for his role in the discovery. The media attention had one positive effect. It prompted other local residents to come forward with information about World War II military activity in the Pine Valley area. Jake received calls from elderly residents who remembered their parents talking about military planes flying over the valley during the war, and from families who had found pieces of aircraft wreckage on their properties over the years. Most significantly, Jake received a call from Margaret Wilson, an 87 woman who had lived in Pine Valley her entire life. Margaret's father had been a rancher during World War II, and she remembered him talking about a military plane that had crashed in the valley sometime in 1943. "My father never told us exactly where the plane went down," Margaret explained during a phone conversation with Jake. But he said the military came and talked to all the local ranchers about keeping quiet about it. They told everyone it was a matter of national security. Margaret's information provided historical context for Jake's discovery and suggested that local residents had known about the crash at the time, but had been sworn to secrecy by military authorities. The fact that the crash site had remained undisturbed for over 70 years was probably due to the effectiveness of that wartime secrecy. The discovery of a potentially treasure-laden military aircraft on the Circle M Ranch divided the Pine Valley community in ways that Jake had not anticipated. Some residents were excited about the attention and potential economic benefits that the discovery might bring to the area. Others were concerned about the disruption to their quiet rural lifestyle and the possibility that treasure hunters might invade the valley. At the Tuesday morning coffee gathering at Maggie's Cafe, Jake found himself the center of attention in a way that made him uncomfortable. Ed Baker was supportive and excited about the discovery, while Frank Henderson worried about the impact on local property values and the ranching way of life. "Jake," Frank said over coffee and pie, "I hope you know what you're getting into here. Once word gets out that there's treasure buried in these hills, we're going to have every crazy person in the country showing up with metal detectors and shovels." Tom Reeves was more optimistic about the potential benefits of the discovery. "Think about it," Tom argued. "This could put Pine Valley on the map. We could have museums, tourism, historical sites. It might be the best thing that's happened to this community in decades." The debate reflected broader concerns about change and development in rural communities. Pine Valley had remained largely unchanged for generations, and many residents valued the isolation and traditional lifestyle that the discovery might threaten. Jake found himself caught in the middle of these community tensions. He had never intended to become the center of a major historical discovery. I was beginning to understand that his life would never return to its previous quiet routine. Regardless of what the investigation ultimately revealed, the pressure was particularly intense because the federal investigation was still in its preliminary stages. Colonel Mitchell's team was conducting additional surveys and preparing for possible excavation work, but they had not yet confirmed what type of aircraft was buried on Jake's property or whether it contained valuable cargo. "Mr. Morrison, Colonel," Mitchell told Jake during one of their regular briefings, "I want you to understand that this investigation could take months to complete. We need to proceed carefully to preserve any historical artifacts and to ensure that we follow proper procedures. If we do find human remains or classified materials, while the federal government had promised to compensate Jake for his costs and any disruption to his ranch operations, the immediate financial impact of the investigation was becoming serious. The Geological survey had cost $17,000 legal consultations. Were adding up, and the constant disruption was making it difficult for Jake to maintain his normal ranch operations. Jake's cattle and horses were still avoiding the investigation area, which meant that he had lost access to some of his best grazing land during a critical time of year. He was having to purchase additional hay to feed his animals, and the stress of the situation was affecting the overall health and productivity of his herd. The media attention was also creating unexpected costs. Jake had been forced to install additional security measures around his property to keep out unauthorized visitors, and he was spending hours each day dealing with phone calls and inquiries that prevented him from focusing on ranch work. Rebecca Martinez was helping Jake document all costs related to the discovery so that he could seek reimbursement from the federal government. But the paperwork was complex and time-consuming. Jake was learning that dealing with federal bureaucracy required patience and persistence that tested his practical rancher's approach to problem-solving. Rebecca advised during one of their meetings, "You need to think of this as a long-term investment in your property and your family's legacy. If this discovery turns out to be as significant as it appears, it could ultimately benefit you financially and historically. But you need to be prepared for a process that could take years to fully resolve." The financial strain was compounded by uncertainty about what the investigation would ultimately reveal. If the buried aircraft contained valuable cargo, Jake might eventually receive compensation that would more than offset his costs. But if the plane turned out to be empty or historically insignificant, he could end up losing money on the entire venture. Jake's conservative rancher's instincts were telling him to be cautious about incurring additional costs. But his curiosity and commitment to the investigation were pushing him to continue, regardless of the financial risk. He had come too far to turn back now, and the federal team's enthusiasm suggested that the discovery was indeed significant. By the end of October, the federal investigation had confirmed that there was definitely a large aircraft buried in Jake's south pasture. But Colonel Mitchell's team was still preparing for the excavation work that would reveal exactly what type of plane it was and whether it contained cargo or human remains. The waiting was perhaps the most difficult part of the entire process for Jake. His ranch operations were disrupted, his financial resources were strained, and his quiet life had been transformed into a circus of media attention and government investigation. Yet he still didn't know whether his discovery would ultimately justify all the costs and complications. Jake's animals continued to avoid the investigation area, which provided ongoing confirmation that they had been right to be suspicious of the south pasture. But their continued nervousness also reminded Jake daily that his life had been permanently changed by whatever was buried beneath his feet. The federal team was being cautious about proceeding with excavation work because of the possibility that the aircraft contained unexploded ordnance, classified materials, or human remains. Each of these possibilities required different, specialized procedures and could significantly extend the timeline for the investigation. Mr. Morrison, Colonel Mitchell, explained during one of their regular briefings, "We're dealing with a crash site that could contain sensitive materials. We need to proceed methodically to ensure that we handle whatever we find appropriately and safely." Jake understood the need for caution, but the uncertainty was taking a psychological toll. It committed significant financial resources and disrupted his entire life based on his animals' behavior in the preliminary survey results. Now he was waiting to learn whether that commitment would be validated or whether he had made an expensive mistake. The investigation had also strained Jake's relationships with some members of his family and community. His daughter Emma was worried about the media attention and the potential impact on the family's privacy. Some of his neighbors were concerned about the long-term effects of the discovery on the valley's quiet rural character. A dad Emma said during one of her calls, "I'm worried that you're getting in over your head with all this government investigation stuff. Maybe you should consider stepping back and letting them handle everything without your involvement." But Jake had gone too far to step back now. The discovery was happening on his property. It was affecting his animals. It was disrupting his life in ways that required his active participation. Whether he liked it or not, he was now part of a story that was much larger than his individual ranch operation. As November arrived with its first serious snowfall, Jake Morrison found himself in a position he could never have imagined just 2 months earlier. He was at the center of a federal investigation that might uncover one of the most significant military aircraft discoveries in Colorado history. The quiet rancher who had trusted his animals' instincts was about to learn whether that trust would lead to vindication or disappointment. The waiting was almost over. Colonel Mitchell had announced that excavation work would begin as soon as weather conditions permitted, probably within the next 2 weeks. After months of investigation and speculation, Jake would finally learn what had been hidden beneath his south pasture for over 70 years. Whatever they found would change his life forever. But Jake had already learned that some changes were beyond human control. Sometimes the most important discoveries came not from seeking treasure, but from paying attention to the wisdom of the animals who shared the land and trusted their instincts, even when logic suggested otherwise. The mystery was about to be solved, but Jake suspected that the real adventure was just beginning. The first week of November brought a brief warming spell that melted the early snow and created ideal conditions for excavation work. Colonel Mitchell's federal team had spent the intervening weeks preparing for what would be one of the most carefully documented aircraft recovery operations in modern military history. The excavation site had been secured with military precision, complete with perimeter fencing, security checkpoints, and round-the-clock guards to keep out unauthorized visitors and media personnel. Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the excavation area on a crisp Monday morning, watching as Army Corps of Engineers personnel began the delicate process of removing decades of accumulated soil from above the buried aircraft. The scene resembled an archaeological dig more than the ranch operation that had occupied this land for over a century. Sophisticated equipment hummed quietly as teams of specialists worked with brushes and small tools to carefully expose whatever lay beneath. Dr. Amanda Foster, the lead archaeologist for the federal team, explained the excavation process to Jake. As work began, every shovelful of dirt would be sifted for artifacts, every exposed surface would be photographed and documented, and every step of the process would be recorded for historical preservation and potential legal proceedings. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Foster said as she adjusted her equipment, this type of excavation can't be rushed. We might be uncovering human remains, classified military equipment, or historically significant artifacts. Everything must be preserved and documented according to federal standards. The first day of excavation revealed the unmistakable outline of an aircraft wing buried approximately 8 feet below the surface. The aluminum skin was corroded but largely intact, and stenciled numbers were still visible on the exposed section. Within hours, military historians had identified the aircraft as a C-47 Skytrain, the workhorse transport plane that had served in every theater of World War II. Jake's horses and cattle maintained their distance from the excavation site, even though the buried aircraft was being gradually exposed. Their continued nervousness suggested that whatever had been affecting their behavior was still present, possibly indicating that the aircraft contained something more than just aluminum and steel. Colonel Mitchell called Jake aside as the first. Day's work concluded, Mr. Morrison. Our preliminary examination suggests this aircraft was carrying cargo when it crashed. The weight distribution and the way it's sitting in the ground indicates there was substantial load in the cargo compartment. The possibility that the aircraft contained cargo added urgency to the excavation process. Military transport planes during World War II had carried everything from ammunition and medical supplies to classified documents and valuable materials needed for the war effort. If this particular C-47 had been carrying precious metals or other high-value cargo, the discovery could be far more significant than anyone had initially imagined. The excavation team worked with painstaking care over the next 3 days, gradually exposing more of the aircraft's fuselage and wing structure. Each new section revealed additional details about the plane's final moments and the circumstances of its crash. The aircraft appeared to have hit the ground hard, but had not burned, suggesting that the crew might have attempted an emergency landing rather than simply falling out of the sky. On Thursday morning, the excavation team made their first major discovery inside the aircraft. Dr. Foster's team had carefully cut through the corroded cargo door, had begun exploring the interior of the plane with fiber optic cameras and specialized lighting equipment. What they found inside exceeded everyone's most optimistic expectations. The cargo compartment contained dozens of wooden crates, remarkably well preserved by the dry Colorado soil and the aircraft's intact structure. The crates were stacked and secured according to military transport protocols, suggesting that this had been a planned cargo mission rather than an emergency evacuation or crash landing. Dr. Foster emerged from the aircraft cargo hold with barely contained excitement. Colonel Mitchell, you need to see this. The cargo compartment is filled with wooden crates that appear to be intact and properly secured. Some of them have military markings that suggest they contain high-value materials. Jake felt his heart racing as he watched the federal team prepare to examine the cargo crates. Months of investigation, financial strain, and disrupted ranch operations had led to this moment. Whatever was in those crates would determine whether his trust in his animal's instincts had been justified or whether he had spent his life savings chasing a mystery that would yield nothing but historical significance. The process of removing the first cargo crate from the aircraft required another day of careful preparation. The crate weighed over 200 pounds and had to be lifted through the cargo door using specialized equipment that wouldn't damage the aircraft structure or the crate's contents. Every step was photographed and documented by multiple team members. Colonel Mitchell insisted that Jake be present when the first crate was opened. Mr. Morrison, this discovery is happening on your property because you had the wisdom to trust your animals and the courage to investigate something that didn't make sense. You deserve to be here when we find out what this is all about. The crate opening took place in a specially constructed tent that provided controlled lighting and clean working conditions. Dr. Foster and her team used conservation-grade tools, to carefully remove the wooden slats that had protected the crate's contents for over 70 years. Inside the first crate, nestled in military specification packing material, were rows of gold bars. Each bar was approximately the size of a standard brick, marked with U.S. Treasury stamps and serial numbers that identified them as part of the federal gold reserves. The bars were tarnished but otherwise in perfect condition, protected by the crate's careful construction and the Colorado soil's preservative qualities. Jake stared at the gold bars in stunned silence. He had hoped the investigation would reveal something significant, but the reality of finding actual treasure exceeded his wildest expectations. Each bar represented more money than he had ever seen at one time, and the crate contained dozens of them. Colonel Mitchell was examining the treasury markings on the gold bars with obvious excitement. These serial numbers indicate this gold was part of a classified shipment during 1943. He explained to Jake. During the war, the federal government moved large quantities of gold and other precious metals to secure locations to prevent them from falling into enemy hands if the coasts were invaded. Dr. Foster was documenting each gold bar with photographs and detailed measurements. The preliminary count suggested the first crate contained approximately 150 pounds of gold bars, worth over $4 million at current precious metal prices, and there were dozens of additional crates still in the aircraft cargo hold. The discovery of gold in the first crate validated Jake's investigation in the most dramatic way possible. But it also created new complications. Federal law regarding treasure discovered on private property was complex, and the fact that this gold had originally belonged to the U.S. government added additional legal considerations. Rebecca Martinez, Jake's attorney, had been standing by for this moment. She immediately began documenting the discovery and researching the legal precedents for civilian discoveries of lost government property. The initial research suggested that Jake would be entitled to a substantial finder's fee, but the exact amount would depend on negotiations with federal authorities and the total value of the cargo. Jake, Rebecca explained as the team continued. Examining the gold bars, this discovery puts you in a very strong legal position. You reported the find properly, you've cooperated fully with the federal investigation, and the treasure was discovered on your property through your own initiative and expense. The government will want to recover their gold, but they'll have to compensate you fairly for your role in finding it. The excavation and examination of the remaining cargo crates continued for another week, revealing the true scope of what had been hidden beneath the Circle M Ranch for over 70 years. The C-47 had been carrying what military historians later described as one of the largest single shipments of precious metals and valuable materials ever lost during World War II. In addition to the gold bars, the aircraft cargo hold contained crates of silver ingots, bags of rare coins, boxes of precious stones, and even several crates containing currency from various allied nations. The total value of the cargo, according to preliminary estimates by federal treasure specialists, exceeded $40 million at current market prices. The discovery made headlines around the world. Jake Morrison, the quiet Colorado rancher who had trusted his horse's instincts, had uncovered one of the most valuable treasure finds in American history. Media crews from every major news organization descended on Pine Valley, transforming the small rural community into an international news destination. Jake found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never sought and wasn't sure he wanted. Interview requests came from television networks, magazines, and documentary filmmakers from around the globe. The story had everything that captured public imagination: a humble rancher, mysterious animal behavior, buried treasure, and a connection to one of the most significant events in human history. But Jake's initial reaction was more subdued than celebratory. The discovery vindicated his investigation and promised to solve his financial concerns, but it also meant that his quiet ranch life was gone forever. The media attention, federal involvement, and legal complexities would continue for years, regardless of how the treasure issue was ultimately resolved. Colonel Mitchell's team worked to establish the historical context of the aircraft and its cargo. Research into military archives revealed that the C-47 had been part of a classified operation to relocate federal gold reserves to secure locations in the Mountain West. The aircraft had disappeared during a storm. In November 1943, in search, efforts had been unsuccessful because of wartime secrecy requirements and the remote location of the crash site. The pilot and co-pilot had been listed as missing in action. Their families had never learned the fate of their loved ones. The discovery of the aircraft would finally provide closure for families who had waited over 70 years for answers. About their relatives' disappearance, Dr. Foster's team found the remains of both crew members in the aircraft cockpit, along with personal effects and military records that would allow for proper military burial with full honors. The human element of the discovery added emotional weight to what might otherwise have been simply a treasure story. Mr. Morrison, Colonel Mitchell said during one of their daily briefings, "This discovery has significance far beyond the monetary value of the cargo. You've helped solve a 70-year-old mystery and provided closure for families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. That's a contribution that can't be measured in dollars." The legal process of determining ownership and compensation for the treasure. Discovery took 6 months of negotiations between Jake's legal team, federal attorneys, and various government agencies. The case established important precedents for civilian discoveries of lost government property and attracted attention from legal scholars around the country. Rebecca Martinez proved to be an exceptional advocate for Jake's interests. She argued successfully that Jake's substantial investment in the investigation, his cooperation with federal authorities, and his legal right as the property owner entitled him to a significant percentage of the treasure's value rather than just a modest finder's fee. The final settlement awarded Jake 40% of the treasure's appraised value, which amounted to over $16 million after all legal and administrative costs were deducted. The federal government retained the remaining 60% to return the gold and other materials to federal reserves, but acknowledged that Jake's discovery had saved taxpayers the enormous cost of an indefinite search operation. The settlement also included compensation for Jake's investigation costs, legal fees, and disruption to his ranch operations. More importantly, it established his rights to any future discoveries on his property and provided legal protection against treasure hunters who might attempt unauthorized searches on the Circle M Ranch. Jake Morrison, who had started the year as a modestly successful rancher with normal financial concerns, found himself a multimillionaire before his 59th birthday. But perhaps more significantly, he had become a symbol of the rewards that could come from trusting instincts, taking calculated risks, and pursuing mysteries that others might have ignored. The financial windfall solved all of Jake's immediate concerns and provided security for his family's future. But it also presented new challenges and responsibilities that he had never anticipated. Managing sudden wealth required financial advisors, tax specialists, and investment consultants who could help Jake preserve and grow his newfound fortune. Emma, Jake's daughter, was amazed by her father's transformation from struggling rancher to wealthy celebrity. "Dad," she said during one of her visits to the ranch, "I have to admit I thought you were making a terrible mistake when you started spending money on surveys and investigations. I never imagined it would lead to anything like this." The treasure discovery also strengthened Jake's relationships with his neighbors and community members who had supported his investigation. Ed Baker, Frank Henderson, and Tom Reeves became local celebrities themselves as the story of Jake's discovery spread around the world. Pine Valley, Colorado, population 847, found itself on tourist maps and featured in travel guides as the place where a rancher's horses had led to the discovery of buried treasure. The most significant change in Jake's life wasn't financial, but philosophical. The experience of trusting his animal's instincts and pursuing an investigation that everyone else thought was crazy had taught him important lessons about risk, intuition, and the value of following unconventional paths. Jake decided to use his newfound wealth and celebrity to support other people who were facing situations that required courage to pursue unconventional solutions. He established the Morrison Foundation for Intuitive Investigation, which provided funding and support for individuals whose animal behavior observations or other unconventional research might lead to significant discoveries. The foundation's first grant went to a marine biologist in California who had noticed unusual behavior patterns in dolphins that might indicate underwater archaeological sites. The second grant supported a farmer in Iowa whose cattle behavior suggested the presence of underground water sources that could help address drought conditions. "I learned that animals know things we don't understand," Jake explained during a speech at Colorado State University. "If we're smart enough to pay attention and brave enough to investigate, we might discover things that change our lives and help other people in ways we never imagined." Jake also used his platform to advocate for better research into animal behavior and its potential applications for scientific discovery. He funded research programs at several universities and established scholarships for students studying animal psychology and behavioral science. The Circle M Ranch itself became a destination for researchers. Students and tourists interested in the story of how animal behavior had led to one of the most significant treasure discoveries in American history. Jake carefully managed the tourism aspect to preserve the ranch's working operation, while sharing the story with people who could learn from his experience. The horses and cattle that had started the entire adventure by avoiding the south pasture returned to normal behavior patterns once the aircraft and its cargo were fully excavated. Jake often wondered whether the animals had been responding to magnetic fields from the metal cargo, underground vibrations from the aircraft structure, or some other phenomenon that science couldn't yet explain. "I'll probably never know exactly what my animals were detecting," Jake said during one of his interviews, "but I know they were trying to tell me something important. The smartest thing I ever did was listen to them." The discovery of the C-47 and its cargo became the subject of multiple books, documentaries, and academic studies. Military historians used the find to better understand World War II logistics operations and the federal government's efforts to protect valuable resources during the war. The aircraft itself was carefully preserved and eventually became the centerpiece of a new World War II museum in Colorado Springs. The museum told the complete story of the aircraft, its crew, and the cargo it had been carrying, providing context for Jake's discovery, and honoring the sacrifice of the military personnel who had died in service to their country. Jake insisted that the museum exhibit include a section about animal behavior and its potential applications for historical and archaeological research. He wanted visitors to understand that the discovery had resulted from paying attention to subtle signs that were easily overlooked or dismissed. The crew members whose remains had been discovered in the aircraft were buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. Families, some of whom traveled from around the country to attend the ceremony, thanked Jake personally for solving the mystery of their relatives' disappearance and providing closure after 7 decades of uncertainty. Colonel Mitchell, who had led the federal investigation, became a close friend and advisor to Jake. "Mr. Morrison," the colonel said during the military burial ceremony, "you've shown that ordinary citizens can make extraordinary contributions to our understanding of history and our honor for those who have served. This discovery will be remembered long after all of us are gone." The story of Jake Morrison and his treasure-finding horses became part of American folklore, inspiring countless other people to pay closer attention to animal behavior and to pursue investigations of mysteries that might otherwise be ignored. Ranchers around the country began reporting unusual animal behavior patterns, hoping that their observations might lead to similar discoveries. 5 years after the discovery, Jake Morrison remained on the Circle M Ranch, though his life had been transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The ranch operation continued much as it had for 4 generations. But Jake now had the resources to implement improvements and conservation measures that ensured the land would remain productive for future generations. Jake had married Dr. Helen Morrison, the veterinarian who had initially helped him investigate his animal's strange behavior. Their shared interest in animal psychology and their mutual respect for the intelligence of livestock had developed into a deep personal relationship that surprised both of them. "I never thought I'd find love again at my age," Jake said during an interview on the 5th anniversary of the discovery. "But Helen understood what the animals were trying to tell me before I understood it myself. She saw the significance of their behavior when everyone else thought I was chasing shadows." Emma and her family had moved back to Colorado, attracted by the opportunity to be closer to Jake and to be part of the ongoing legacy of the discovery. Emma had taken over much of the day-to-day management of the Morrison Foundation, using her veterinary training and business skills to evaluate grant applications and support research projects. The grandchildren, Michael and Sophie, had become enthusiastic junior ranchers who loved hearing stories about their grandfather's treasure-hunting horses. They had learned to ride and work cattle, carrying on family traditions, while also understanding that their heritage now included one of the most famous discoveries in modern American history. Jake's relationship with his animals had deepened as a result of the discovery experience. He paid even closer attention to their behavior patterns and had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when they were responding to something. Beyond normal ranch activities, the horses taught me that there's always more going on than we realize, Jake reflected. Animals live in a world of sensations and information that we barely understand if we're smart enough to pay attention. They can teach us things that change everything. Interestingly, Jake's animals continue to occasionally exhibit unusual behavior patterns in other areas of the ranch, suggesting that the C-47 discovery might not be the only secret hidden beneath. The Circle M ground-penetrating radar surveys of other areas had revealed additional anomalies that might represent other crashed aircraft, buried equipment, or geological formations that attracted animal attention. Jake had chosen not to pursue these additional investigations immediately, preferring to allow his life to stabilize after the dramatic changes of the past few years. But he had documented the locations where his animals showed unusual behavior, creating a map that might guide future research when he was ready to pursue new mysteries. "There's probably more out there," Jake admitted during a recent interview. "The horses and cattle still act strange in a couple of other areas, but I've learned that some mysteries are worth waiting for. When the time is right, we'll investigate." Further, the possibility of additional discoveries had attracted the attention of researchers and treasure hunters from around the world. But Jake had been careful to maintain control over any future investigations on his property. The legal precedents established by the C-47 discovery protected his rights and ensured that any future finds would be handled properly. Dr. Foster, the archaeologist who had led the aircraft excavation, had remained in contact with Jake and continued to study the behavioral patterns of his animals. Her research had contributed to a growing body of scientific literature about animal detection of subsurface anomalies and its potential applications for archaeological and geological research. Jake Morrison's discovery represents a new frontier in archaeological methodology. Dr. Foster wrote in a recent academic paper, "Animal behavior may provide clues to historical sites and geological formations that traditional survey methods would miss. The implications for future research are extraordinary." The story of Jake Morrison and his treasure-finding horses had resonated with people around the world because it represented universal themes about intuition, courage, and the rewards that could come from pursuing unconventional paths. Jake had become a reluctant but effective spokesperson for the idea that ordinary people could make extraordinary discoveries if they were willing to trust their instincts and take calculated risks. "I'm not special," Jake often said during his speaking engagements. "I'm just a rancher who was smart enough to listen to his animals and stubborn enough to keep investigating when everyone else thought I was wasting my time and money." The real heroes of this story are the horses and cattle who kept trying to tell me something important until I finally paid attention. The Morrison Foundation had grown into a significant organization that supported unconventional research and investigation around the world. Projects funded by the foundation had led to discoveries of underground water sources, archaeological sites, mineral deposits, and even oil reserves that had been located through animal behavior observations. Jake had learned that his experience was not unique. Throughout history, animals had provided clues to important discoveries that humans had initially overlooked or dismissed. The Foundation's mission was to encourage more systematic attention to animal behavior and to support people who were brave enough to pursue investigations based on unconventional observations. "Animals see the world differently than we do," Jake explained during a recent television interview. "They detect things we can't sense and respond to information that we don't understand. If we're wise enough to watch them carefully and brave enough to act on what we observe, we might discover things that change our lives and benefit everyone." As Jake Morrison approached his 64th birthday, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with his horses avoiding a seemingly normal pasture. The discovery had brought him wealth, fame, and opportunities he could never have imagined. But it had also taught him important lessons about the value of paying attention to subtle signs and trusting instincts even when logic suggested otherwise. The Circle M Ranch remained a working cattle operation, but it had also become a symbol of the potential that existed. When people were willing to investigate mysteries that others might ignore, the story had inspired countless individuals to pay closer attention to animal behavior, pursue unconventional research, and take calculated risks in pursuit of discoveries that might benefit society. Jake's horses and cattle continued to thrive on the ranch, their descendants carrying forward the bloodlines of the animals, whose instincts had led to one of the most significant treasure discoveries in American history. The South Pasture, where the C-47 had been buried, was now marked by a simple monument that honored both the military crew who had died in service and the animals, whose behavior had led to the discovery of their final resting place. Sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most unexpected sources, Jake said during a recent speech at a ranching conference. My horses didn't set out to find buried treasure, and I didn't start investigating their behavior because I thought it would make me rich. We were just trying to understand something that didn't make sense. But that curiosity and willingness to investigate led to discoveries that changed everything. The story of Jake Morrison and his treasure-finding horses had become part of American folklore, a reminder that extraordinary possibilities existed for those who were observant enough to notice unusual patterns and brave enough to pursue them despite skepticism from others. It was proof that the most valuable discoveries often came not from sophisticated technology or advanced planning, but from paying attention to the wisdom of animals and trusting instincts that couldn't be easily explained. In the end, Jake Morrison had discovered that the greatest treasure wasn't the $40 million in gold and precious metals that had been buried beneath his ranch. The greatest treasure was the knowledge that ordinary people could make extraordinary discoveries when they had the courage to trust their instincts, the persistence to pursue mysteries that others dismissed, and the wisdom to recognize that animals often understood things that humans had yet to learn. The horses and cattle of the Circle M Ranch had taught their owner one of the most valuable lessons of all, that the world was full of secrets waiting to be discovered by those who were patient enough to watch, brave enough to investigate, and wise enough to listen to the creatures who shared the land and understood its hidden stories better than anyone had ever imagined. Jake Morrison's story proved that sometimes the most extraordinary adventures began with the simplest observation. When animals behaved strangely, there was usually a very good reason why. And sometimes, if you were lucky enough and brave enough to investigate that reason, you might just discover something that would change your life forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. This one hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.